Good evening. Hello. Thank you all for coming this evening. I'm Kirsty Wilson. I'm one of the two co-chairs of Lawyers Against Poverty. The other co-chair is somewhere between here and Bristol. I am hopeful that he is somewhere closer to here than Bristol, and that's Richard. And a number of people have got caught up in I wouldn't say travel chaos. That's a little bit overstating it, but a little bit of travel challenges today. So first of all, thank you all very much for coming to what is our second annual annual event for Lawyers Against Poverty. And I will introduce our esteemed speaker in a moment or two. But if I could just say a few things to get us kicked off. First of all, I did want to thank Latham and Watkins for again hosting us back and looking after us so well for this evening. And then I also wanted to say that we've got, so the running order for tonight, you were due to have sort of 3 different people doing the introductions, but you're now down to me. So I apologize for that. And then we've got Hashi Mohamed, who's going to speak to us and for sort of half an hour-ish after me. And then we've got Q&A. So I very much encourage you to think of your questions, both about what we hear tonight, but more widely as well. And that should be a great session. We are recording the session so that it's available later. What will probably happen is that for the Q&A, we will edit that so that the questions and answers can be as free and open as possible. Just a couple of things about Lawyers Against Poverty. At this moment in time, you need to imagine that Joss Saunders, I'm handing to Joss to say, here is Joss. And Joss was the inspiration behind Lawyers Against Poverty. And maybe just to start off, how many people have been to a Lawyers Against Poverty event before, whether online or you were here last year? We've got, yeah, great. A few returners. That's super to see. And then any in the room tonight that are either members of our junior Lawyers Against Poverty or Lawyers Against Poverty in general? Any? Yep. Good. So lots of people that Lawyers Against Poverty are the charity is new to. So maybe I'll spend a few moments just saying who and what Lawyers Against Poverty are then. So it is a 7 or 8-year-old organization, and it is for anyone in law. So lawyers, anybody involved in law, training, anybody at any age or any stage in your career, or just and with an interest. And what it was established so that we could, as individuals, harness the energy and the enthusiasm and the skills of lawyers to tackle many of the different issues surrounding poverty and, as the name says, to alleviate poverty as well. So, and we're a little bit different than other organizations in that we're not focused on pro bono. This is about us as the power of the individual brought together as a collective can make more of a difference. And that's not to say that pro bono isn't important. And I know many, if not all of us in this room are probably doing pro bono advice as well. But whereas we are a collection of individuals and that collection comes together to make an impact. And you may have seen in our annual report or online some of the things that Lawyers Against Poverty have been doing in the last few years. We've divided sort of 2 main areas that we focus on. One, we have a justice fund where we utilize our memberships on a monthly or yearly basis to fund strategic litigation, to support some cases and actions both in the UK and around the world, and also so that we can make little bits of funding to help make a difference on that. And then the other area is around our thematic groups. So we have our women's rights. I can see Naomi, one of our trustees over there, our land rights group, ethical business, and our refugee rights. And has anybody taken part in one of our refugee legal confidence sessions? There we go. Super, super, because that, without downplaying the other areas, has really been sort of the flagship element of how Lawyers Against Poverty has been developing. And you might have a question later that you can share with the room on that. But that's a great example of where we've been partnering with community groups, both, spreading out all over the country. Started in Oxford, but we've been in a number of different cities and towns now to do sessions both online and in person to take people who have recently, for example, gained settled status, about in manageable bite-sized chunks, things such as the UK justice system, education, health, to help people find their way, navigate through life in Britain today. So that's a couple of the areas where Lawyers Against Poverty have been active. Please do help yourself to the annual report, and actually I should say this, I'm very happy for you to have a look, well, when I'm speaking in particular, at the lawyersagainstpoverty.org. You'll find out lots more information on there. And then maybe have a conversation. We've got Naomi. I think our other trustees have unfortunately either fallen ill or fallen foul of the trains. And Richard will be here, but very happy to chat further with everybody later on. So jumping on to my next role. So you've got 3 different roles here. And I would like to introduce Hashi to you. Hashi Mohamed, fair to say, I think you agreed that I could say you're a man of many talents. A barrister at Landmark Chambers, a published author, and we'll be hearing more from possibly both of your books this evening as well, and also a broadcaster, both on radio. And you may have caught Hashi on Question Time in January. There, and please do not apologise for that at all. So that was earlier this year. I'd certainly a very good intervention. Before handing over, I just want to say, your 2 books are, and the first one was Britain, People Like Us, What It Takes to Make It in Modern Britain, was Book of the Week on Radio 4, which if Radio 4, if that still goes out about just around 11 o'clock at night, I'm sure a lot of people were provoked to stopping their sleep at that point with a number of the elements of that. So, and the second one, which was just published just over a year ago, A Home of One's Own, on the housing crisis and what we need to, some hopefully of the solutions that we need to be taking to address that. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Hashi. And thank you very much for joining us on our 2nd annual lecture.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Kirsty. And for those who were unable to make it because of train issues, they have very poor excuse because you came all the way from Scotland today. So if you've managed to come all the way from Scotland, I don't think it would have been that difficult to get here from Oxford. But anyway, thank you very much for having me. Thank you to Latham Watkins as well. Come on through. Hi, Pascal. And yes, so what I was hoping to do this evening was to speak to what this issue means for me in terms of Lawyers Against Poverty, and particularly also reflect on the current climate in which we find ourselves in terms of how our world is shaping up, and particularly around the legal profession and around what is said to be one of the biggest and most important election years at the moment. But I also really I'm struggling, as many of you, to find much hope in the current situation, whether that's be on the issue of climate, whether it's on the issue of what's going on in the Middle East, whether it's to do with the housing crisis, whether it's to do with the general feeling of what it means to be a member of society today. It is one of those really, really difficult moments to think about what it all means. So I was really, really pleased to see that Philippe Sands gave last year's lecture, because Philippe is a very good friend, and he was one of the people who gave me a lovely quote for my book as well. So it was quite lovely of him to say that. And he's currently actually in the ICJ arguing on behalf of Palestine, presenting his case last week and this week. So it's a real honor to be in such good company. Now, I'll take what I wanted to say in about 3 parts, really, and then open it up for Q&A, because I think that's probably the more fruitful part of our discussions, to hear from as many of you as possible. The first is I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about me. As you know, I'm a barrister at Landmark Chambers. I practice predominantly in planning and environment law, with a focus on housing and the housing crisis. I represent local authorities, I represent developers, local action groups, individuals. And so I have a wide-ranging practice that tries to see the problem of the housing issue from as many different perspectives as possible. But I started out in Kenya, and that's where I was born to 2 Somali parents who had been leaving Somalia a few years before as the war was brewing, and I was born in Kenya to parents who were never formally educated. They never had any formal education. My mother, bless her, still with us and still thriving, gave birth to 12 children, if you can imagine. So me being number 8 in that list, I was kind of glad she didn't obviously stop after number 7, because I wouldn't be here, but I wish she did after number 8, because it just got out of control. And so, you know, in that early 1990s, a few things came together that precipitated the arrival of our community, and many Somalis fleeing the war in the early 1990s to Britain. And for me, it was the sad death of my father in a car crash in Kenya, and the war breaking out, and also this follow of communities and individuals going around everywhere in the world to seek a new start and a new beginning. Now, what that meant for us as a family was that some of my siblings ended up in America, some ended up in Canada, and we ended up in the UK without my mum, and we're obviously having just buried my father. So arriving in this country as a sort of brand new a person who is a 9-year-old boy, trying to make sense of what it means to be a child who's here without his parents, and in a culture that you don't understand, in a language you do not speak, and without adults to be able to help you make sense of who you are, why you're here, and what it all means. Now, if I pause there, and one of the things I had reflected on when I was writing my first book was just what it means, thinking about poverty, thinking about what it means to grow up in this kind of society as a young child, trying to grope your way through society, is I researched a great deal of what happens to a child in those early years, what it means to be growing up, what it means to be socially mobile, what it means, and the impact that it has on your life. And this is what I wrote in the book about those early years and how critical those early years are for anyone. No period of your life is as important as your first 4 years. It is when the basic structure of your brain is formed, shaping your capacities for language, reasoning, and for interacting with others and with your environment. Your early years set the course of the rest of your life, a course that is extremely hard to correct later on. And deprivation begins in the womb. Children born into poverty are more likely to be born premature, are more likely to have low birth weight, and receive less nutrition in the womb. All factors associated with poorer future health. They're also at a higher risk of infant mortality. They're more likely to have mothers who suffer from postnatal depression and stress during pregnancy, something that can affect the way in which their genes are expressed. As babies and young children, they often live in inadequate housing and are part of families that struggle to afford enough food and heating, creating the stressful situations that rewire their brains to make them anxious and jumpy. And so when we think about poverty, and we think about particularly childhood poverty, it's really, really important that we understand that those first 4 years can be so transformative, and the impacts that it has on who you are, the development of your brain, the kind of society that you grow up in, how you see yourself, are remarkably difficult to turn around. And so as a 9-year-old boy arriving here, thinking about what that all meant and thinking about how you digest all of that feeling that is both psychological, physiological, and so on, is very, very hard to explain the standing start that begins in that context and how hard it is to turn that world around. I grew up in Northwest London in some of the most deprived areas, went to a failing school, survived, went to the University of Hertfordshire School of Law for my undergraduate law degree. I took French alongside that. I, learned French abroad, came back, I took a year out to work, applied for a master's to go Oxford University, was able to get a master's place with a full scholarship. I got back to London and I thought, okay, maybe I want to pursue this career as a barrister, maybe. I got a work experience and an opportunity on a short-term contract working for the BBC. And then I really enjoyed that experience, but didn't see myself as a journalist for a long time. Applied for a full scholarship to be training at the bar, and that was also transformative because I was able to then train for the bar course. Never really contemplated being a solicitor, being in this building, because I always didn't see myself in that way. I saw myself as somebody who wanted to be self-employed. I saw myself as somebody who wanted to do something different. The idea of having to sit through appraisals with a manager just didn't really tickle my fancy, or having to play a game to become a partner one day, that wasn't for me. So that really was the route that I saw myself going through, and that bar course, subsequently applying for pupillage, getting pupillage. And I always maintained that relationship with the people who gave me a job at the BBC, continued that world in a way that I thought I could carry on practicing as a barrister. But every now and again, I can get out of that world, reflect on the society in which we live in, have my thoughts on what it all means, and not just be somebody who's focused on their own career and making money and just pursuing that world. And that's how some of the documentaries that Kirsty was mentioning, forgot, it's also available on BBC Sounds. Yes. I mean, that's really important detail. You don't have to be awake late at night to listen to them. But that was also quite important because I made a documentary about social mobility. I've made documentaries about the housing crisis. I've made documentaries about getting into the legal profession. And that was quite important because for me, having come from where I've come from to where I find myself now, it's really important that I just don't see myself as an island of somebody who's made it and then forget about everything else, but actually be able to say, look, this is how I've done it against the odds, but it doesn't necessarily mean that will work for everyone. It doesn't necessarily mean that the system is fair. Don't use me as an example of social mobility, boy done good, and therefore everyone else who doesn't do it is either lazy or not willing to work hard enough. Obviously, you're not going to get far if you're not willing to work hard, but that's not necessarily the end all and the beginning and the end. And so that's how my first book came about on social mobility. And then the second book, I was reflecting on 10 years of being a barrister in planning, 10 years of working with local authorities, and 10 years of trying to get planning permission for major developments with important affordable housing schemes, 10 years of all of that. And I thought, what does a home mean? You know, what did it mean to us growing up homeless and in poverty, raised exclusively on state benefits? What does it mean for us as a community that was really, really struggling to make ends meet at an early years? What did it mean to have a home? What did it mean to struggle in that context? And that's how this book came about, a short sort of polemic for me, discussing this issue of what it meant. And so I'll reflect on a small passage about what does it mean to have a home? What does that actually mean in the context? And why is that so important? If you were to pick one issue in the general election that's coming this year, right up there with the issue of the NHS will be housing. And interestingly, when I was researching this book, I discovered that in the post-war period, what we saw was housing was in the public health department. Housing wasn't considered to be an issue that was completely separate to the issue of public health, because the founders of the NHS in 1947-48 were writing that this new thing that we're going to establish called the National Health Service is at risk of collapsing before it even gets off the ground if we don't grapple with the issue of housing. Why? Because if people who are living in incredibly crowded homes are incubating communicable diseases, they will come out of those overcrowded houses, go into our schools and workplaces, spread those diseases, and before you know it, this thing called the National Health Service doesn't stand a chance. And so if you are going to really struggle with that, if you are really going to make sure that the NHS succeeds, you have to deal with housing first. So that's why housing was considered a public health issue right at the beginning. Think about the way we see it today. Think about how many children growing up with asthma, damp and mold, mental health issues. Think about old and young living in these crowded accommodations. Think about the commuting that everybody has to do because they can't live where the jobs are. Think about all of those things and the impact that that's having on our communities, our individuals, and crucially, our productivity. This is my reflection of growing up homeless and my reflections of what it meant in that context. It affects your relationship with trust when you cannot really rely on being able to see your teachers and friends the following week, when you think about moving constantly. When you're constantly having to learn a new route to school, have to visit a new corner shop where the shelves are stacked differently. You end up disoriented, not just in space, but in your relationship with the world and as a whole. When you fit into where you fit into a society you live in, it seeps into your core, infecting your relationship with your surroundings, distorting your perception of reality, and completely transforming your understanding of institutions and what they're there to do. I strongly believe that our lack of prospects, more generally, could be traced back to how we lived. For the absence of firm foundations do little to offer a future that is not built on sand. It is true that Brent and many other inner city areas in Britain today have improved enormously. Relative poverty and more widespread deprivation has improved. Employment, albeit much of it insecure, has gone up. The availability of advice, guidance, and community action groups have all changed how we view poverty and how it affects life chances. Many of the local schools are unrecognizable today, but it is also clear that without drastic changes in the availability of decent housing, and in particular affordable social housing, all other progress will be fundamentally undermined. We cannot continue to talk about the leveling up of society all we want, But if we cannot guarantee our children a proper home they can call their own, we are setting them up for failure. We have failed to appreciate the significant divide that in our richest countries in the world exists among us, the most basic of human rights lacking, a place that remains yours, not just for a night or a month or for a year, a decade, or for as long as you want to stay. So for me, moving on to the second part of what I wanted to say, when I think about the issues of this critical juncture of society, I think about the intergenerational divide that exists. If you are growing up today and you are growing up in an environment where you've just left university, where you have just graduated with an enormous amount of debt, you will struggle to find a job based on whatever it is that you've studied quite relatively easily. You will have stacked up close to 60, 70,000 pounds worth of debt. You'll be extremely lucky if you can afford to move out of home. And you will go on to work longer, retire later, and the idea of having a roof over your head anytime soon, quite remote. That's not because you're not willing to work hard. That's not because you're not willing to get on and do something with your society. That's got nothing to do with the ability to actually want to pursue a career. But it has got everything to do with the way our society is currently structured. That no matter how hard you work, no matter how much you are keen to succeed, the way things are just not geared for this generation. And again, we have to be honest about this because the intergenerational divide that exists is staring us in the face. And I ask one simple question about that. What does that do to the social contract? Why would anybody young growing up today want to invest in this society? Why would they get up every morning, pay their taxes, and pay into a pension pot? What is the incentive? What is the determination? If they cannot achieve the most basic standards that were able to be afforded to the previous generation. The next is about child poverty. Child poverty is on the rise. And as I've already indicated in my first book, those early years are so critical, and we're incapable of providing the most basic needs to so many young people, particularly children, and that we're storing up for a very, very incredibly difficult reckoning coming our way. And that was particularly precipitated negatively by the pandemic, because we saw the most deprived children who were already living in hugely overcrowded spaces slide down further. And somehow the private schools happened to fiddle their grade systems such that they were getting better results. And you don't need to take that from me, that's fact. The statistics are there for you to see for yourself. And that is also another reckoning that is coming our way. Two final thoughts are, we can see the perils of the NHS, but the bit that depresses me the most about all of this is this. We can face a huge amount of problems, and we can face a number of different and potentially insurmountable concerns. That isn't beyond the wit of man. But what particularly really concerns me and depresses me is the way in which those who want to be elected and those who want to be in power lack the ability, the courage, and any attempt to grapple with these issues. Our current crop of political leadership and our current individuals, whether you look at Labour, Tory, or any other political party, frankly, are just not up to the task. And it is embarrassing. It is a joke. And that is, for me, the most devastating part of what we face today. The problems are there. We've done problems before. The solutions are possible. There's going to have to be plenty of compromises. There're going to have to be plenty of people who will lose, and so many others will win. And the difficult decisions have to be confronted. That's not the hard part. The hard part is who is standing up, speaking truth about the scale of the challenge we face today. And whether or not they are wrong or right, whether or not their ideas are perfect, are actually putting forward something that says, this is where I think we should be going. I may be wrong, but this is what I think, and this is why I think it. If you have a different idea or a better idea, then you tell me. And so for me, that is the scale of the challenge we face. It's not so much that we have a huge housing crisis, that the NHS is overwhelmed, that our children are facing major concerns to do with child poverty, that our schools are overwhelmed, whether it's the lack of teachers or buildings collapsing and so on, whether it's the fact that our public servants cannot afford to live in the major cities that we're expecting them to work, where the rich and the poor divide is as wide as it's been in recent times, and so on and so on. Those don't daunt me as an individual, because I think that we have it within us. I really strongly believe that we have it within us, that these problems have credible solutions that we can come up with. But who's willing to stand up and say that? You're obviously keen to say that, so I'll look forward to hearing what you think. So that, for me, is the real vacuum. And then the final thought on that is that vacuum, when that vacuum occurs, what tends to fill in that vacuum is extremities and extremists. And that's what we're seeing in our political spectrum today. When there is a vacuum of leadership, credible leadership, what tends to fill that vacuum is extremism. And that's where I think we're also failing. So not only are we not prepared to confront our problems, not only do we lack the political leadership to be able to do that, we're also descending into a carnage of society just eating away at each other because of the fact that in between the lines is being filled by that extremity. So let me try and finish on a positive note, given that I'm depressing you all a little bit. The positivity comes from organizations like Lawyers Against Poverty, organizations and individuals who give up all of their spare time to try and contribute to the best of society. If I think about the number of my colleagues at the bar who give up so much of their free time to help people, so much contribution to try and bring cases that are strategic and helpful, that when it comes to court will make a difference to so many people's lives. When I think about the way in which we hold the government to account, when we think about the success of the Rwanda litigation that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, when I think about all of these things, I see a huge amount of hope and determination and success. So that's where I really do think is the opportunity. And the final thing I would say, I don't see in the next 10 to 15 years, the political arena being where we find our solutions to society's problems. I really don't. I see in the next 10 to 15 years, the solutions will come from people like you in this room. The solutions will be coming from civil society. The solutions will be coming from us finding ways to deal with a situation where we cannot any longer rely on ministerial decisions to make a difference on the ground. Take in the housing sector. In the housing sector, I'm seeing community land trusts popping up all over, buying land to build affordable housing on it. In the health sector, we are seeing many individuals giving up their time to try and help societies with better living standards, better life quality in order to avoid having to use the NHS one day, and finding ways of teaching people about public health. and so on and so forth. So I really do believe that in the next decade or so, the work that is done by organizations like Why We're Here, the organizations like Latham Watkins and all the other law firms that support this charity, that will be where the real power lies. And that's where the difference will be. So on that note, I'm going to stop talking. That's everything, Kirsty.
That was a great question. That was a fantastic question to finish. And maybe just before handing over to Richard, so my fellow co-chair is now here. Actually, that will be on, so I'll leave that. But maybe just before handing over to Richard, a round of applause.
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, thank you very much. I mean, thank you, Kirsty. We swapped roles because I was going to introduce and welcome everybody. And then Great Western Railways decided my trip was 3.5 hours rather than 1.5. So anyway, so I'm here now, and I'm sorry to have missed the majority of Hashi's speech, but wanted to pass on the huge thanks that people have already said to you, Hashi, for your eloquent insight into these issues. And it's really relevant for us at Lawyers Against Poverty. I'm sure Kirsty's already said, because of our focus on refugee rights and the confidence sessions that we run now in many of the cities. If you have been inspired by what you've heard today, and there's 3 suggestions that I was just writing down as I was hearing Hashi speak. The first one is obviously to read the book and understand the issue and really sort of get involved in helping refugees' rights. The second one is to become a member of LAP. If you are not, Lawyers Against Poverty, there was a few of us trustees in the room already. I can see Naomi with the red jacket there and Pascal here with the black jersey. Please come and speak to us or to Kirsty or to me, obviously, afterwards. And the third one is we are recording this talk, and what we found last year after the Philippe Sands talk was that actually it reached a huge audience. So please do, if this is okay with Hashi, I assume it is, please do send this recording to your friends, to your contacts, and involve them as well in this whole purpose that we have. So I think I need to say a few other thanks. I've got a really big thank you to Latham Watkins and JP. Is he here at the moment? He's probably around somewhere. JP Sweeney is one of our long-term supporters and has helped us and the partners of Latham Watkins in hosting this event and providing some refreshments, which we will go on to have shortly. I'd also like to thank Kirsty for all of the presentations you've made at the beginning of this, and hopefully you've engaged with what she said there. So most of all, I want to thank you guys for coming along, for your interest, your engagement, and I'm really hoping that you can stay involved in the issues and stay involved in LAP as well. So hopefully chat with you over a drink afterwards. And again, so thank you to Hashi for speaking.